The Torah forbids us from using an ox and a donkey to plow together. The question is, does that only refer to an ox and a donkey? We'll see that there's an interesting debate between the Rambam and the Rosh about the parameters of this mitzvah, as well as a fascinating spiritual insight into the meaning behind the prohibition against mixing two different species of animals. And that all starts with the pasuk in this week's parasha. B'shachas and pasuk, in context of the pasuk that says, Lo yisachresh b'shor v'chamor yachdav, that you may not plow with an ox and a donkey together. State in Mishnah, Maseches Bava Kama, the Mishnah in Bava Kama tells us that it means not only an ox and a donkey literally, but echad shor v'echad kol behema, an ox and any kind of animal that is mixed with a different species would be prohibited. If that's the case, in Kain Lamanema Shor Chamor, why did the pasuk specify an ox and a donkey? And a shadiber akasu b'hoivet, that's because the Torah chose to use an example that is most common, and it's typical for people to use oxen and donkeys as work animals. And the Gemara is masber, and then the Gemara adds another perspective, which is as kilaim decharisha, that the prohibition against using two animals of different species together to plow, yalef shor mishabas. The context of that law is derived from the connection between the word shor, ox, used here, and the word shor used in the laws of Shabbos, where it says tichsiv shorcha v'chamorcha v'chol be'emtecha, who may not do work on your behalf on Shabbos, your ox, your donkey, or any of your animals, as Rashi points out, implying that we expand the term shor to include other animals as well. So it's pretty clear that even though the Torah specified two types of animals, it actually refers to other animals as well. The question is, in what context? So that's where the debate is. We're going to see that there's a debate about these details between the Rambam and the Rosh. The Rambam paskent. The Rambam's ruling is that yes, the Torah prohibits specifically an ox and a donkey, but it also extends to any other mixture of two different species where one of the species is non-kosher and the other is kosher. In that case, loikim and Torah, the person would have transgressed a Torah law and would deserve to get malchus. But then the Rambam adds, the rabbis then included or expanded the halacha to include shnei minim shein kilayim b'harba, any two species which would not be permitted to crossbreed. In other words, any two animals that are of a different genus, whether they're kosher or not, you would not be permitted to use them together on the same plow, or to get them to pull something together, or to lead them together. In other words, the various types of activities that are prohibited in this lo sachresh. So according to the Rambam, the Torah only prohibits that mixture if one animal is kosher and one is not. Whereas the Rosh disagrees and says, I don't agree with what the Rambam is saying. On paskent, instead he rules as shneim tohirim or the shneim temeim, even if it's two different species where both of them are kosher or both of them are non-kosher, that is a Torah prohibition. So let's understand what's prompted this debate between the Rambam and the Rosh. Seitzei Machlokas is in the Pirush from the Mishnah in Kilayim. Well, the first clue that we get is that there's a debate about how they understand the Mishnah, or actually a series of two Mishnahs in Kilayim. The Mishnah zogt. First, the Mishnah tells us Kila Behema, that if you have an animal that is potentially a crossbreed with another animal, Motorim Lagadel, you're allowed to bring them up together, Ulakaim, and to keep them in the same environment. The only prohibition is to actively crossbreed those two species of animals. And then on the Mishnah Shachleri says, the next Mishnah says what could sound a little ambiguous. Behema im behema. If it's the type of animal called the behema, which is the so-called more domesticated types of animals, v'chaya im chaya, or the less domesticated types of more wild animals, Tameya im tameya, whether it's a non-kosher with a non-kosher, or tahira im tahira, or it's a kosher with a kosher. Tameya im tahira, if it's a non-kosher animal with a kosher animal, or the reverse, so tahira im tameya, asurin nachrish chulei, they may not plow together. So how do you understand that Mishnah? Because there is some ambiguity to how to punctuate it, and that's possibly the difference between the Rosh and the Rambam. Len the Rosh's understanding of this Mishnah is as masisni tzveita Mishnah, that the second Mishnah includes all possibilities. A kosher animal of a different species with another kosher animal, a non-kosher animal with another non-kosher animal of a different species, are all included in the prohibition against who may not pull a plow together. Das says as the Isser von Kilayim de Chisha is oich da by Tmeya and Tmeya und Tahira im Tahira, which is why the Rosh concludes that the prohibition against having two different kinds of animals pull a plow together is regardless of whether they are both kosher or both non-kosher, it would still apply. The Rambam Obalent in Pirush HaMishnayos, whereas the Rambam in his commentary on the Mishnah learns as the erste etliche Fallen from the zweite Mishnah, the first examples that are included in the second Mishnah, kommt behemshech zu Isra Haba from the erste Mishnah. That was a continuation of the discussion in the previous Mishnah. What kind of animals may you not crossbreed? And then he says it makes no difference if they're kosher, non-kosher. You may not crossbreed them if they're from different species. Then there's a pause in the second Mishnah, and only specifically a non-kosher with a kosher or a kosher with a non-kosher, then those are the ones specifically that may not pull a plow together. And the pshat in the Rambam is, so therefore the pshat, how the Rambam learns this Mishnah, is going to affect the girsa, the version of the Mishnah that he uses. He believes that the Mishnah starts with a qualification. When did the laws of the previous Mishnah apply? As a zayin asur nor milah harbia, that you may not crossbreed animals, behema in behema, whether it's an animal with an animal, chaya in the chaya. Avot tmeya im tahira. But he adds the word but. The second part of the second Mishnah, where it's speaking about a kosher with a non-kosher animal, that's asur neichel acharish chulei. Not only is there prohibition against crossbreeding them, there's an additional prohibition against allowing them to pull a plow together. So it's pretty clear that the Rosh and the Rambam have different versions of how you're supposed to interpret those two Mishnayos in Kilayim, and based on that, whether or not the prohibition against two different animals pulling a plow together is limited only to kosher with non-kosher, or is more expansive, like the Rosh says. Ve'yesh loymar. Okay, so that's their analysis of the Mishnah, but we have to add that there has to be some logical reason why they see the Mishnah differently. It's not just because they have two different ways of interpreting the Mishnah. There's a logical basis for why they interpret that Mishnah differently. Because the Rosh and the Rambam have clearly two different ideas about what the whole logic of the prohibition is. That determines why they debate how you're supposed to interpret this Mishnah, and the version that you're supposed to establish in the Mishnah. Okay, so we're going to propose a possibility, how we think possibly the Rosh and the Rambam are disagreeing. We might have explained as the machlokes verstehen in dem Pirush von dem Klal Dibur Akosov Baheva. Maybe the Rosh and the Rambam have a different view of what Dibur Akosov Baheva means. Which is something that the Mishnah in Bava Kama told us about the crossbreeding of animals, Shor and Chamor. Why those examples? Because they are the more common examples. Later in Rosh, the way the Rosh looks at it, when the Torah says this is the classic example, in other words, the Rosh says the reason that the Torah used this example is only because it is common. That's it. It has no halachic overtones. And therefore we cannot exclude any other kind or species of animals because the Torah used a common example. That we should never think that just because the Torah used the example of an ox and a donkey, therefore we shouldn't think that it excludes other animals. No, it does. It includes any kind of animal because the Torah only used an example that we'd be familiar with. So the Rosh's view is, if the Torah uses an example because it's common, that's the only reason it used that example. The Rambam has a different view, which is, yes, we acknowledge that the Torah will always use the example that is the most common, so it's familiar to us, but it's nicht mistavet zu sagen, as es ist nicht token shum limud von dem, was der Pasuk is mefaret und sagt nicht stam kilaim kayotze bose. But the Rambam says, at the same time, the Torah could have been so generic as to say mixtures, that you made a plow with mixtures. The fact that it wasn't so generic, and it gave us an example, means that there's something to learn from the nature of the example the Torah gave. Therefore the Rambam says, what do I notice about using an ox and a donkey as the example, is that I can extrapolate out a broader perspective to understand about other areas of this halacha. What is the common factor that will be prohibited by the Torah if one animal is a kosher and the other is a non-kosher animal? As when it gets under the Sachen in the Mishnah in Bava Kama, but you'll say there are other examples where the Mishnah in Bava Kama talks about how the Torah gives a classic example, Dibra Kosabaheve, where it talks about an ox falling into a pit, or that you've got to pay double for an item that you've stolen. It uses, for example, a sheep. There's no question that the Rosh and the Rambam agree that these are examples which should extend outwards to include any kind of animal whatsoever, and there's good logic for it. And there everybody is clear that the only reason the Torah used these particular examples of Shor and Chamor is because they're very common animals that people have. The halachas of the animal falling into a pit or the stolen animal is fundamentally different to the story of an animal that is being crossbred or two different species of animals working together. Why? Because what's the focus? But if you're talking about an animal that was injured or died because it fell into a pit, or an animal that was stolen, well, there the Torah is focused on how do we compensate the owner of that animal for his loss. So if the objective is to ensure compensation for the owner of the animal, there's no logical reason to make any difference between what animal it is. But if I'm talking about species, mixing species together to pull a plow, but the whole principle is the mixture of two different types of animals. And then in that context, the Torah is specific to say, not that you may not mix your animals, which it does say, by the way, with regards to the prohibition against crossbreeding animals. It says, as no, here the Torah was much more specific and said, do not plow with an ox and a donkey. Clearly, the Torah is obviously spelling out what kind of animals we should be looking at, kosher and treif. That's the issue. So at this point in time, we believe that the Rosh and the Rambam are debating how you are to understand the principle of diber hakosav boheve. In the Rosh's view, it's purely an example, and it extends to any kind of animal. In the Rambam's view, it's a very specific example to teach us the class of animal that is included in this prohibition. But that's not a good enough explanation. But Kadaikis, when you pay closer attention to it, ken men as a neat learner, you cannot explain that this is the Rambam's view. First of all, it is totally counterintuitive to explain that dibur hakosav b'hoiva does not just simply mean an example, but actually means setting the tone for the halachic parameters of the concept in halacha. That's never how we understand dibur hakosav b'hoiva. Plus, specifically in the Rambam's case, the Rambam is meforish the Mishnah in Bava Kama. When the Rambam comments on that Mishnah and explains that Mishnah in Bava Kama, he says, there he says clearly that when it speaks about the prohibition against using two different animals to pull a plow, it means any kind of animal, including if the two animals are different species of kosher or non-kosher. No, the only thing he says is that it's a rabbinic institution, that it applies to any kind of animal. Whereas as far as the Torah is concerned, the only limitation is when it's a kosher. With a non-kosher animal, like the example presented in the Torah, an ox and a donkey. The Mela is move on, which shows us clearly. The Rambam clearly believes that Dibra HaKosav B'Hoiva, which is the language that the Mishnah was using, that language is, like the Rosh says, this was an example, and the halacha, at least rabbinically, includes all kinds of animals. So it's really a stretch to suggest that the Rambam has a radically different understanding of the expression Dibra HaKosav B'Hoiva. In the period when Dibra HaKosav B'Hoiva, which means we cannot explain that the reason the Rambam believes that the only prohibition in the Torah against having two animals pull a plow together is if one is kosher and is not kosher, that was based on the words Dibur HaKosav B'Hoiva. That cannot be the explanation, because it doesn't sound that way from the way the Rambam explains that Mishnah, which is the Mishnah of Dibur HaKosav B'Hoiva. So what is the Rambam's reasoning? Let's try another approach. Why is it that you're not allowed to have an ox and a donkey or two different animals pull a plow together? There are two main schools of thought about this. One school of thought, which is the Ramban, and I think Rabbi Bechaya and a few others, they say, as the is Misherish Isar Habos Habhemikilaim, that it's a subcategory of the prohibition against crossbreeding. Why? Because it's quite normal for people who are working with animals on their field to bring them all together into a single kraal, into a single area, and to allow them, or maybe even to encourage them to crossbreed. In other words, it's kind of the next step of what's going to happen. Whereas there are other opinions, Like, for example, the Sefer HaChinuch that the problem with having two different animals pulling a plow together is you're causing distress to one of those animals. Or possibly to both. Maybe that is what lies at the core of the debate between the Rambam and the Rosh. The Das HaRosh, coming from the perspective of the Rosh, is just he goes with the school of thought that the reason you may not have two animals pull a plow is because it's too close for comfort to the principle of crossbreeding. Because having them work together means it's quite likely that they're actually going to crossbreed. Over Mele is this a guilty of alle zwei minim zusammen, Punkt wie bei Kilaim Darbo, and then it doesn't matter what kind of a creature it is. Any creatures that are mixed together, you have this problem. They might land up crossbreeding. Whereas the Rambam would go with the school of thought that the problem with having two different animals pull a plow is you're going to cause pain to animals. That would explain why the Rambam says, as far as the Torah is concerned, this is only really a problem if one animal is kosher and the other is not. What's the problem? Let's say, for example, the example the Torah uses, which is the donkey and the ox and the donkey. That the ox is chewing the cud, whereas the donkey does not. So the donkey gets the impression that the ox is eating when he's not eating, and that could cause him distress. As the time from the Mitzvah is, or to expand it a little bit further, as skipped a line over there, the way the Sefer HaChinuch explains it, as the time from the Tsar is that the reason that there's pain when you have two different animals, one kosher, not kosher, working together is it's very distressful for animals and birds, for that matter, to work or to be in the environment of animals that are different to them. So it's difficult to be in the same environment, and it's certainly difficult to work together because they have different temperaments and different natures, and it doesn't work. And the ikatzar is, and therefore the ultimate pain is when you have two different species, like the example of the ox and the donkey, when one is kosher, that is not, where the ox and the donkey are extremely different natures. In fact, later when we speak about the perspective of Chassidus, we'll emphasize this point. So maybe that's what it is. The Rosh says our concern is working together leads to crossbreeding, and the Rambam says that the problem is you're not going to you're going to cause distress to the animals. But even that is quite a stretch. Are you suggesting that the whole reason that you cannot have two different animals pull a plow together is because of tzar b'alei chaim, because you're going to cause distress to animals? Where did the Torah place this prohibition against animals pulling a plow? In the middle of the discussion about various forbidden mixtures. Mixing produce together with vines, or shatnez, which is wool and linen. Even in the Mishnah, where it brought up the prohibition against two animals working together, it brought in Masechta Kilayim. It brought it in the tractate that speaks about Kilayim between Kilayim Darbo, and in the same conversation around the prohibition against crossbreeding animals. So it's quite far-fetched then to say, but the Rambam believes it's got nothing to do with that, only to do with Tzar B'alei Chaim. As the Rambam Alein is Mevorim Meir Nevuchim, especially when you consider that the Rambam himself in Meir Nevuchim, which admittedly is not a book of halacha, but it would be a stretch to say that he has fundamentally different outlooks in Meir Nevuchim to what he has in the Yad HaChazakah. As a time from Kilayim Tacharisha is, there in Meir Nevuchim, the Rambam says the prohibition against two different species pulling a plow is because it's pretty close that when you are working two animals together, you will crossbreed those animals. So it's a very difficult suggestion that the Rambam's perspective is we want to prevent tzar b'alei chaim. So what is the core of the difference between the Rambam and the Rosh, that the Rambam says the Torah only prohibits a kosher with a non-kosher animal working together, and the Rosh says it applies from the Torah to all animals? So machlokas is tzidin from kilayim dacharisho is a chelik from kilayim darbo. So therefore we must distill the debate as follows. Is the prohibition against two animals working together, in this case pulling the plow, is that a subcategory of the prohibition against crossbreeding animals? Or there is one set of laws about crossbreeding animals and an independent mitzvah where you are not allowed to work two different animals together? So the Rosh halt, if that's how we're splitting this, the Rosh would go from the view as kilaim dacharisha is the zel be'in ve'kilaim darboa, that the prohibition against mixing two animals in the work environment is the same halachic category as the prohibition against crossbreeding to animals. On the Rambam halt as zayin b'fnei atzmai, whereas the Rambam says they're two different categories. There's a category of crossbreeding, which is forbidden, and a separate halachic category against two different types of animals working together, which is also forbidden. Why? So what sits at the core of trying to understand whether these are one and the same category or two different categories of halacha is to understand that kilaim is toichnei erev taruvas. To understand that the whole principle of kilaim is mixing things which naturally should not mix. So that's a Rambam. Is this a kilaim darboa verbunden mit taruvas welche is nicker v'goloi? The Rambam says, look, if you take two different animals and you crossbreed them, the nature of that union will produce a visible forbidden mixture. What's going to happen is you're going to land up with a mule. You're going to land up with an animal that looks and behaves and has characteristics which are unique, not like the either parent. I mean, chodesh, it's a new species which is the product of mixing two species together. Whereas the Rambam would say, if you have two different animals working together on a plow, you won't see a visible difference in what the field looks like after it has been plowed. It will look exactly identical to if it was plowed by the animals. So therefore the Rambam's view is, you don't see the problem in a visible fashion. It's not the same halacha. Therefore, the Rambam sees that these are two different concepts. Crossbreeding produces an entity, a creature that is new and unique. Working two different animals together does not create anything which is new and unique. And therefore, there's a chiluk zwischen kilaim darbo as zayin ba'ad shnei minim. Therefore, there's an halachic difference between crossbreeding, which applies to any kind of mixture between two species, and kilaim dacharisha, versus the mixture that is two animals working together, dafka min Torah min tamei, when the problem is not the outcome, and therefore the problem is only limited to if one animal is kosher and the other is non-kosher. Aber the Rosh halten, whereas the Rosh believes as by Beiden, sai by kilam darbo, sai by kilam dacharisha. The Rosh's view is whether you're crossbreeding the animals or whether the two animals are working together, is the the problem is not the result. The problem is the action of using two species or mixing two species together, and therefore the same halacha would apply whether it is all or some of the species. Doesn't make a difference. In other words, if it's kosher and non-kosher or it's any kind of an animal, the fact is mixing different species is problematic. The Biranal is Rambam, but still in the context of the Rambam, we still have a little question niggling in the back of our minds, because look at what the Rambam says. From there was the Rambam Paskan. There are three key elements of what the Rambam rules about the prohibition against crossbreeding. As Aleph, first of all, he tells us, you're allowed to take two different species, put them in the same stable. And if they then crossbreed, you don't even have to interfere. Not only that, let's say that a person didn't follow the law and they did crossbreed two different species, you're allowed to benefit from the resultant species. You can have a mule carry your load. Not only that, Gimel, as far as the Rambam is concerned, the prohibition against crossbreeding is when the person physically facilitates the crossbreeding. Is mashma. As bei Kilaim darbo ist die Gedau ist nicht verbunden damit, was zuvor während Neule told us, and welches ist nicker, wie Gott in our cover. The fact that the Rambam is speaking so much about your active or inactive role in crossbreeding implies that this has absolutely nothing to do with what's going to emerge, what's going to be born. It has everything to do with the action taken in the crossbreeding process. Now, the etzem ma'aser kova harbo is aser. Just simply being proactively involved in crossbreeding, that's what is forbidden. So it's not so comfortable just to say, oh, the Rambam says the big issue is what the resulting creature is going to look like. In which case, the Rambam must also agree that the prohibition against the mixture of two animals pulling a plow is similar to, if not the same as, the prohibition against crossbreeding. I am not allowed to do it. This is mashmei lefun, but the Rambam is a kilin in perik and ilchas kilaim, which, by the way, is borne out by the fact that the Rambam includes these two sets of laws in one section in the laws of kilaim. Is because what they both have in common, they're both the same prohibition. I may not cause this mixture to happen. So let's understand better the distinction between the Rosh and the Rambam. The Teichen von Nisi Kilayim is the prohibition against Kilayim. Is putting together two things that are contrary, not just different, contrary to each other. We take two things that are contrary to each other, grain and grapes, linen and wool, and you mix them together. You're taking two opposite things and you're bringing them together into a mixture. That is Kilayim. But what that looks like, what that mixture is completely different depending on the circumstances. By harba, if you're cross-breeding animals, but the chibis betachlis, that's absolute mixing of two different things together. To borrow the expression of the pasuk about any form of intimacy, two separate things become a single entity. That is the ultimate version of kilayim. That's the ultimate version of mixing two things that don't belong together, that contradict each other. So it doesn't matter what the nature is of the two types of animals, if they're different to each other, that is kilayim. You have mixed something, should never mix. But the chibur von jedem min hat Eibishter eingestellt dafke lemineo, because the way that Eibishter designed it is that species belongs with that species, and that species belongs with that species, and here's somebody interfering and mixing those species together in a way that they become absolutely one. That, it doesn't matter what kind of a creature it is problematic. But when you're mixing two different animals to pull a plow, they're not personally connecting, they're just collaborating to do something which is external to them. They are not fundamentally kilayim, which means mixtures. They're not mixed. It's an activity that is being achieved with two separate kind of species. Yes, they are different animals. Yes, they have different qualities, etc. So that's why it's a prohibited mixture, but it's not in the deepest, most intimate sense of mixing. And to give it even greater understanding, let's look from the perspective spiritually. The Chassidus also gives two possibilities of what the issue is with kilayim. In two different parts of Chassidus, we find two different explanations about why you may not plow with the ox and the donkey together. Aleph, one explanation is one thing is that the chamor, the donkey, represents a very intense version of klipa. We don't want to put it too close to the ox, which has the potential of kedusha, because we don't want the donkey to be able to draw energy from kedusha. The one explanation. The other explanation is basically this is valsher is b'chinas gvuras and chamor is b'chinas chasodim u'nosel arvam yachad. And the other is that a donkey represents the energy of chesed, whereas an ox represents the energy of gvura, and they should not mix together. Both are absolutely valid and both are absolute Torah. As die zwei Biurim seine Behesem zu deplukte von Rambam mit den Rosh. So these two explanations align respectively with the view of the Rambam and the view of the Rosh. Leit Shitas Rambam, according to the Rambam, where the only prohibition against, as far as the Torah is concerned, against Leisachroish is kosher and non-kosher animals. As the love from Leisachroish is by mintor im mintomei. So that would go with the first explanation we had, which is as klippers on mikabel zayin from kedusha. We don't want impurity, klipper represented by the chamor, by the donkey, to nurture from kedusha represented by the ox. Because an ox, which belongs to the kosher type of animals, that's why the Rambam specifies kosher animals. They are klippas noiga, which can be released from the realm of klippa and elevated through to become fully kedusha. We don't want that together with a non-kosher animal represented by the donkey, because non-kosher animals are completely trapped in absolute klippa and can never escape. So therefore, if you do an activity with a kosher and non-kosher animal together, then it is possible that the negative, so-called non-kosher, so-called impure animal could be able to absorb some of the energy and the positivity which belongs in the kosher animal and should never have gone there. The Shittas HaRosh, whereas the Rosh comes from a different perspective. As this is guilty minim, he holds that the prohibition against mixing two animals is regardless of whether they're kosher and non-kosher, doesn't make a difference. Even if there's no concern about leeching onto the kedusha and sapping some of the life into klipa, even if they're both kosher or they're both non-kosher. The Rosh comes from the perspective you don't want to mix these two creatures together, because the Eibusha created different kinds of midos, like he created the chesed represented in a donkey and the gvura represented in an ox, and they're supposed to stay in their lane and they shouldn't mix together, and therefore regardless of what kind of an animal it is, if they're different species, you don't mix them on the field. And that gives us another beautiful insight. Moving, as a mitzvah, kedusha, teis, we understand that a mitzvah or kedusha, or adding divine revelation in the world, has the power to bring opposites together. Like the pasuk says, Michol Sal Shamayim. That means Malach Michol is the chesed angel, and therefore seen as the master of water. But Gabriel Sar Shal Eish, and Gabriel is the Gevura angel, and therefore seen as the master of fire. When the Eibusha puts them together, they don't dilute each other, they don't destroy each other, they don't extinguish each other. Aber nicht has schon tefis unika Kabbalah beklippe, was der Pfarrer sitzt big the Kohune begonnen macht nur kile Shatnes. Was several Bishops sagen, heftig sind ist aber bei der Heter. So what Torah can do, what mitzvahs can do, what kedusha can do, is take two things that are different energies and amalgamate them, harmonize them, bring them together. Not only that, it is even possible for them to take two things that shouldn't be together, like the example of Shatnez, wool and linen. And in the context of Kedusha, like in Tzitzis, or the belt of the Kohanim, you could have Shatnas come together. Why? Because wool is fundamentally not forbidden, and linen is not forbidden. So it's just the mixture that is problematic. Well, the power of Torah is so much that it could even allow them to be together without causing any problems. But that cannot happen with something that is absolutely not kosher. Therefore, you can't put the donkey and the ox together if one of them is non-kosher. But when you have the power of Torah and you take things which are not naturally together and you put them together, then you can have beauty, you can have greatness, and you can have the clothing of the Kohanim, which was l'chaved l'tifaris, to bring them honor and to bring them beauty, and yet dafka specifically from a mixture of shatnas, because that is the power of Torah, to take energies that don't necessarily collaborate and don't necessarily work so well together, chesed and gevura, and you could put them together and have a beautiful and a wonderful outcome, the chibur of the right and left, chesed, gevura, etc. And we should be zeiche to see the big day kahuna on the kehanim, and with that the shalom ba'olam and the shalom between the shor chamor, even with the coming of Mashiach now.